Hello, folks. Okay, well, so far we've gone through and we put together one really simple automation script in Bash to apply some test cases to a program that we're trying to test. And we took a look at a Bash script to go through and parse a bunch of command line options so we could kind of extract all the different options the user might supply, store them as settings, grab whatever other data values they provided. So we've looked at some background material. What I want to do next is take a look at what it might take to create a much more flexible, more powerful test automation setup, still using Bash. And the way we'll break it up is we'll come up with one script that will simply apply one test case to a program. So this script is going to be much more flexible than the one that we put together earlier, in that there are going to be a lot of different options that we can provide to it to determine what kind of things it's taking in and what it's going to do with them as it runs the program under test. So we'll have a more advanced script for applying just a single test case. But again, this is going to be a fairly flexible script where you can do a lot of different things. You can take that test case in a lot of different ways and with a lot of different options. And then to apply a whole suite of test cases, what we'll have is a second script that basically goes through and figures out what suite of test cases you want to run, and then repeatedly calls this first script with the options for this particular test case. So it figures out, okay, for test case 1, what do I have to do to call tester 2? For test case 2, what do I have to do to call it? For test case 3, what do I have to do to call it? So we'll separate the problem into kind of two distinct subproblems. One for just all the gory details for handling a single test case, because that's going to be complex enough. And then something that just goes through and repeatedly grabs a next test case and passes the appropriate stuff off to our single test case handler. So that's where we want to go. After that, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the actual development of test cases for something like this. But that's the idea. For this particular session, I want to focus on the script for running a single test case. So that's where we'll go. Let's see what we've got here. So we're not actually going to implement this, but as we walk through and discuss it, you'll see that each of the individual pieces is something that you could do, something that's reasonably straightforward. It's just a matter of sitting down and working out the Bash syntax for it and debugging the beastie. But again, the idea is we want this script to take a bunch of different options from the user and run a single test case on a program based on those options. So it allows the user to specify all the different options to use. It's going to go through and make sure that the user actually provided valid options, and then it'll run the test and summarize the results. If the user provides invalid arguments, then they'll get an appropriate error message. Or in this case, it maybe display the word error and some description. If it's given valid arguments, then it'll run the test case and either display pass or fail. And then if it failed, it'll give some kind of information about the results. So it might tell you all sorts of different bits and pieces about the nature of the failure. So what we'll do is look at a script that can allow the user to do the following. Right? The user should be able to specify the name of some setup script to run first. So for your test case, you might need to do things like, I don't know, you want to test if the program under test works correctly if it's given the name of a file that's locked, right, where they don't have write permission or read permission or something like that. So the test case might require you to run some special script to set up the conditions for that test case. So the options for our test script here is that the user can say, okay, before this test case runs, I want you to run this script. The user can specify any command line arguments that are going to go to the test script. Right? The user can specify the name of a script to run afterwards, probably to undo whatever the setup script did. Right? So now we're starting to think in more detail about what might be involved in running a test case. There might be setup, run the test, clean up. So we're providing a means in our script to do that. And again, this is just the idea that there might be an option like dash setup followed by a script name, or dash cleanup followed by a script name. And again, as we've seen, we can do something like that relatively easily. And you know how in your bash script, right, in your test script itself, you could go through and say, okay, well, we see a dash setup, let's grab the name of the script that's afterwards, check to make sure that it's actually readable and executable, right? Check to make sure that such a script exists. And we know how to run it once we get there, right? So we can quite happily do this relatively easily. So the user can specify setup and cleanup. The user can specify, for this particular test case, what should the exit status be? We might have a program that's supposed to give an exit status of 3 on some particular error, right? And we want to test if that actually happens. So as part of the test case, the user can say, okay, well, run this setup script. When you run the test case, it should give us, in this case, a value of 3 as an exit status. The user can specify what the expected output's going to be, what the expected standard error output's going to be, and what the expected combined output's going to be. And for each of those, we'll assume that the user actually specifies a file that's got that information in it. So maybe we've got options like dash stdout and then a file name that specifies, okay, this file's got the output that we're expecting to see go to standard output. Maybe we've got dash combined or something like that, and then a file name that says, okay, this file's going to have the combined output with the standard error and standard out mixed. Maybe we've got a dash stderror and then a file name that specifies, okay, this file contains the contents that we're expecting to see go to standard error. So again, we're just providing lists of options that the user has the ability to specify. Now, if we're going to run some program, test some program, that might expect command line arguments. So the user has to be able to specify what set of command line arguments are supposed to be used for this test case. So again, this could be, a dash args or something like that, and then a file name, saying, okay, this file's got the list of arguments to be fed in when you run the program under test. Right, so all of these are different options that the user should be able to specify for a test case if we want a reasonably generic, or reasonably general testing script. So again, here we'll just come up with a bunch of options that we'll use for this. So dash T and then a file name will be what the user provides to specify, this is the program I actually want to test. Dash I and a file name for the input file, right, the standard input to be used. Dash A and a file name, and that file is supposed to have all the command line arguments that are supposed to be passed to the program under test. Dash R and a file name for the results, the expected status value when this thing finishes. Dash O for the expected output. Dash E for the expected standard error. Maybe dash capital O for the combined output, standard output and standard error. Dash C for the script to be run after the test to check for side effects and things that might have taken place. Right? Dash capital C for the command line arguments to be passed to the checking script. So again, you could have a script that you want to run afterwards to see how things work, to see if this actually passed or failed as well. Dash S for a setup script. Maybe dash capital S and the name of a file for the arguments to be passed to the setup script, right? All of these are different options that we could reasonably include in our testing script. And the idea is we have defaults for all of them, and we parse the command line arguments that the user actually provides when they run this test case, or when they run the test script for this test case, and we just go through and change the arguments that are used. And then the way our script would behave is, right, we go through, parse the command line arguments, check that the arguments are actually valid, Check that, for the ones that expect a file name afterwards, that the file is actually valid as well. Store all the settings that they gave, right, replacing the defaults. Run the setup script if that's required, with its command line arguments if they were supplied. Right, set up temp files to capture standard output, standard error, both, neither, depending on which options the user provided. Right, run the item that's being tested. Use the command line arguments that they provided in that file, and using the standard input that they provided in that file, again, if any. Go through, direct the standard output or standard error or both, so we might require 2 runs of the thing under test if we're trying to capture the output separated and the output combined. Right, so direct this stuff to the temp files that we created for that purpose. Capture the exit status. We could do things like we did in our earlier version of the script, where we stuck in limits on the CPU time or the amount of data to store as well. So those are options that could easily be added to this. Right, if there was a checker script that was supposed to run afterwards, we do that, right, using its command line arguments if they were supplied, and check if that worked or not. Check that the return value matched what we expected or not. Check that the outputs matched what we were expecting based on those files or not. And then for each of them, we could go through and say, pass or fail. If it passed all of them, then fine, we just say pass. But if it failed, then we could give them some kind of an idea of which portions it failed. So if the standard error didn't match, we could print out a keyword for that. If the standard output didn't match, if the output didn't match, right, if the combined output didn't match, if the return value didn't match, if the checker said that it failed. And so you've got all these different bits of extra information that you could provide for the tester saying it failed, the standard error was wrong, and the return value was wrong. Right? The exit status was wrong. And again, you can see how each of these individual increments is not that much more complicated than anything we've done so far. And again, if we're doing an incremental development approach, what we would probably do is say, okay, well, let's go through and at first just have it run the executable. Right, and then go through and say, okay, now let's see if it can run a checker, a setup script beforehand and get that part running. And then say, okay, now can it run a checker script afterwards and get that working? And now can they provide command line arguments, get that working? Now can they provide an input file, get that working? Again, you just take this one step at a time, building up your script as you go, testing your testing script as you go, until eventually you get something that does all of this and works. And again, we could add in options for things like CPU limits, for output limits. Right? We can check that the exit status is correct. All of this we can go through and add just one step at a time, and eventually what we've got is a very powerful scripting environment. Right? We can use, if there are additional complications in terms of, if the script that if the program that we're testing was supposed to do something to a particular file, then we can have things like the checker that goes through that file afterwards to make sure that it matches expectations. So the user, the tester, has the ability to create very sophisticated tests that do really interesting things to check that the behavior is actually correct. And we can handle all of that in a nice, simple fashion in this testing script. And again, using this testing script isn't that complicated, right? The user just has to know which options are available, and really all they're doing is saying, okay, well, for this test case, I have to provide, these 5 different files that I'm going to use, and make sure that they've got the right content in them. Right? But the mechanics are nice and straightforward, and the script is not that complicated to write. So the idea is, now that we've got this, we can put together a second script, a different script, that will go through a whole slew of different test cases the user has, and say, okay, now let's call this script on each of those different test cases, providing the correct options for each one. So that's where we'll go next. All right, lots of fun.